All right. Happy Saturday, everyone. I am the dramatic historian. And today we are very fortunate to have Chris Kolakowski here with us. He is the editor of the 10th Army Commander, the World War II Diary of Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. Thank you so much for coming on, Chris. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me. Looking forward to the discussion.
I actually want to start this discussion with who is Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. We always talk about when it comes to World War II, we talk about Patton, we talk about Eisenhower, we talk about MacArthur, of course. How could anyone forget MacArthur? I would just kind of like you to introduce us to this character because he's not someone that I heard of, especially within the past 5 years.
No. So his death, and I say this in the book, his death removed, he was going to write a memoir after the war, and it removed some important chapters in American military history. For people who may not be familiar, Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. was born in 1885. He's the son of Simon Bolivar Buckner, who is a very prominent Civil War figure, and was actually elected governor of Kentucky shortly after Jr. was born. Goes to West Point, doesn't serve in World War I overseas, but has several tours as an instructor at West Point, including Commandant of Cadets in the 1930s. And people under his mentorship, Peyton Abrams, William Westmoreland, some of the prominent generals of Vietnam are under his mentorship. He's probably best known in World War II for his command of the Alaska Department from 1940 to 1944. In fact, a lot of the modern infrastructure of Alaska was built under his aegis in the early, right before or immediately after Pearl Harbor. And then, of course, for his command of U.S. 10th Army during the Battle of Okinawa, April to June 1945. And, of course, he is the senior American killed in action by enemy fire, both in World War II, but also in the entire 20th century, when Japanese artillery strikes him down on June 18th, 1945. He's buried today in Kentucky, 1 month shy of his 59th birthday when he died. So that gives you kind of a very, very basic overview. Incredibly consequential life. When you start to kind of unpack the family and unpack his life and career, he touched so many people. You talked about George Patton. They were at West Point at the same time. They were also at VMI at the same time before both of them went to West Point, transferred to West Point to be precise. And, so things like that. And Theodore Roosevelt appointed him to West Point. So you start to get in, it's like, wow, this guy really went a lot of places and met a lot of really fascinating people.
Well, one of the things that struck me right off the bat in his diary is if you go through each one of those days, it's like, oh, I met with so and so, I met with so and so. I mean, the amount of people that he spoke with and talked with, whether it was for personal reasons or for the operations themselves, I couldn't believe it. I mean, he was a very busy guy. But I have to ask though, what was it that actually drew you to his story? Why even bother going through his diary, editing it? How did that come about?
So there was a Civil War Roundtable, the Civil War Roundtable of Northern New Jersey a few years ago. The Phil Kearney Roundtable wanted me in 2018 to speak at their Christmas banquet, and they wanted to do a dual biography of the MacArthurs and the Buckners, Civil War to World War. In both cases, for those who may not be familiar, Dad served in the Civil War. Simon Bolivar Buckner Sr., Arthur MacArthur. Son, very prominent in World War II. Buckner Jr., Douglas MacArthur. And in the course of doing that research, I discovered that there was Buckner Jr.'s papers were available, not widely used, hadn't really been, the family didn't donate. They donated copies to the Eisenhower Presidential Library in the 1990s, but there was a lot of obscurity about him. I realized there's something there. And like every single one of my book topics, it reached out and grabbed me and said, you're the person to do this. And I was familiar with his dad. I'd worked at Perryville Battlefield where his father fought. I knew the area, knew Kentucky. I'd lived in Kentucky for 7 years, knew a lot of the area, knew a lot of the sources. And I realized what was actually available and the pieces that could be put together. And I said, there's something here. And fortunately, Casemate agreed. And the rest, as they say, is history.
I'm glad that's how it all worked out regardless. So we've already touched on the fact that his father was a Civil War general. His father served in a number of battles and actually lived a very long life even after the Civil War. It was very fulfilled. How much of an influence do you think his father actually had on his upbringing as well as just kind of his, personality and possibly decision making?
To understand the son, you've got to understand the father.
Yeah.
And I will, to cite just a few small examples. His father was born April 1st, 1823. Buckner Sr. April 1st, 1945, when Buckner Jr. is about to lead 10th Army, it's the first day of the invasion of Okinawa, he notes in there, it's my father's birthday. And, I've noted that. I said, that tells me something about his influence. And he quotes in a letter to his son that is also in the book, advice that his father had given him when he went to West Point, because Buckner Sr. also went to West Point. Buckner Jr. went to West Point, and then one of Buckner Jr.'s sons was West Point class of 1948. And in the letter to that son, Bill Buckner, William Claiborne Buckner, he said, this is what my dad told me, and you should do the same thing. And it is, always do your duty where it may lie, and never forget you're a gentleman. Which, when you know that quote, and you look at Simon Bolivar Buckner Sr.'s Civil War career, suddenly it adds an extra layer of understanding, if you will. So, and then I would add the definite things that the father did, that Buckner Sr. did for Buckner Jr. First of all, taking him all over the country when they traveled. They went to Europe in the early 20th century, toured all over Europe, watched the Kaiser review the Prussian army, and Buckner Sr. turns to Buckner Jr. and says that man is going to get his country into some very serious trouble one day. Also, Buckner Sr. got to know Theodore Roosevelt, and was able to negotiate the presidential appointment for his son to go to West Point. And then if you look, the family, father and son kept up a very lively correspondence during the time at West Point. And I reproduced some of those letters in the book, particularly in footnotes, but also as Buckner Jr. goes off to his first duty assignments. So there's absolutely no question that the father, to understand the son, you've got to start with the father.
Can you tell us a little bit about his service in World War I? Because I don't think it goes as planned as he initially wanted it to. And then, of course, following World War I as well.
So Buckner Jr. has a very interesting start to World War I. He's actually out in the Philippines, newly married. He and his wife have just finished the honeymoon. They're back in the Philippines. United States enters World War I, August 6, 1917. He writes immediately to Theodore Roosevelt and said, I heard there's talk that you might be forming a division to go, basically a new Rough Riders, 1898 not being that far in the past, and immediately gets a response and basically says, I will serve with you. I would love to serve with you. And gets a response from Theodore Roosevelt. I had you down on my list, but the president, Woodrow Wilson, won't send me. And so Buckner Jr. tries to actually join the Army Air Corps, but fails the eyesight test. And he gets really angry with the selection board because he's a crack shot. He's like, how can I fail the eyesight test? But nonetheless, regulations being regulations, he does come back to the States and actually spends most of the war in Texas at Kelly Field training air cadets and giving them ground school and kind of running the ground school and things like that. Ends the war in the War Department, the air section of the War Department's general staff, which is actually really interesting because when you think about in World War II, how he's a very well-rounded officer because he's an infantryman by commissioning, but this air service makes him able to work with airmen very, very well, particularly if you look at 11th Air Force in Alaska, but also 10th Air Force or 10th Army on Okinawa. 10th Army was unique among all the American field armies in the war that it had its own tactical air force underneath the Army commander. In every other case, the air commander was at minimum equal, if not a completely independent command. He's able to work with them because of this, in part because of this experience. It's, to me, it's something that's completely underrated about what kind of a broad background that he had. But yeah, and then after the war, he goes to West Point. Douglas MacArthur, they picked Douglas MacArthur as the new superintendent of West Point, and a whole bunch of young kind of, up-and-coming officers, Matthew Ridgway, Omar Bradley, of course, Buckner as well, to come and put West Point back together. Just like the Civil War, you think about how during the Civil War, they graduated several West Point classes early. What that does is, yes, that produces officers immediately for the Army, but it wrecks the cadet structure. So all of your upper classes are gone. The upper classes that normally pass on what they, and train the lower classes, that's all gone. And in several cases, they graduate, like October 1918, they graduate the class of 1921 and call them back as student officers. You can imagine how well that goes over,
Yeah.
right? So West Point is in complete disarray. And these officers under MacArthur's leadership are given the task of putting it back together. And it has been said that MacArthur's, during his superintendency, saved West Point. And one of the people that helped do that was Buckner. Buckner was a tactical officer, which meant that he was one of the advisors to the Corps of Cadets and one of kind of the overseers under the commandant of the Corps of Cadets. And he and a couple of his fellow tactical officers, or TACs as they're called, realized normally there are a lot of things like cadet administration, cadet discipline that would normally be handled by the first class, the second class, the top two classes that just aren't here because of all the graduations. We have to fill that role. And so for a good 2 years, they helped put together again the structure of the West Point Corps of Cadets. And it succeeds. It succeeds. Among the officers that go through that and get their mentorship, probably one of the biggest ones is Hoyt Vandenberg, later Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force, Maxwell Taylor, 1st Airborne, and of course, very prominent roles in senior military leadership into the 50s and 60s. So, they're marking a generation of officers that will ultimately end up into World War II and in some cases lead the nation afterwards as well. But it's completely underrated. If you don't know, it's not very well known, but in some ways West Point was saved, and Buckner was one of the people that helped save West Point as an institution, which of course is his alma mater and his dad's alma mater too.
Wow, I didn't know that. I think what's really interesting here is that I don't really know how it is in the military. I don't know if it's this feeling that you have to serve sometime before the next big thing, or if you just want to be in the action. I don't know how that works, but it seems like there were a number of officers between. You have Eisenhower, who he doesn't serve in any action in World War One, and then of course you have Buckner Jr. Same thing, but it seems like their ability, they built a different skill set than those people that actually went in the engagements. And that experience obviously shaped their role in World War II. And one of the most impressive pieces about Buckner Jr. is the fact that he was able to work with so many different people. I would say the Navy as well. That was the big thing that I was really impressed by, because I don't think many Army commanders are good at doing that. But I think that was impressive, which we'll get to here in a minute. And then, of course, as far as West Point is concerned, I didn't understand just how bad it was at West Point following that. I never even considered that. But it makes perfect sense that would be the case. There's a front within the Pacific Theater that I feel like a lot of people tend to forget about. And you brought this up at the beginning, which is Alaska. And you want to just kind of explain well, first off, why Alaska, then how Buckner Jr. actually ended up getting involved in that as well.
Alaska in 1940, right, a few months after World War II begins in Europe, but also the Japanese are starting to be expansionist, particularly the fall of France in the summer of 1940. Japanese are starting to look at expanding down into Indochina, which is a French colony at the time, taking advantage of French weakness, looking potentially at the Dutch colonies, since Holland was also overrun at the same time. So there's a real concern suddenly about U.S. positions in the Pacific. And one of those concerns is Alaska. Alaska is a territory at this point. It will not become a state until 1959. It's the 49th state. Alaska is huge. It is 20% of the land area of the lower 48 U.S. states. If you were to cut Alaska in half, it's the largest state by land area. If you were to cut Alaska in half, Texas would no longer be the second largest state by land area. It would now be third. That's how big Alaska is. It's a giant peninsula that stretches, basically, it's 800 miles wide by about 900 miles long. And if you go all the way to the western tip of the Aleutian Islands in the international date line, that's another 700, 800 miles. So it's vast. It's huge. It hadn't been really well defended. There were only 400 troops stationed at one port or one fort when they start to get serious about Alaska defense. And there's one cannon in all of Alaska. and it was a monument. It was an old Russian cannon because we had bought Alaska from the Russians in 1867. Buckner is sent there to prepare Alaska. And there are two reasons why Alaska suddenly becomes really, really important. The first one is, if you look on a map, it is one of the shortest and most direct ways from Tokyo to the North American continent. And the second one is tied as well to the first, which is air routes. Billy Mitchell in the 1930s said that who controls Alaska controls the Northern Hemisphere. And if you look at a map of, not necessarily a Mercator projection, but if you look at a map of the North Pole and the countries that surround it, Alaska sits right in the middle. And if you think about the air routes to even today, commercial airliners, if you're flying from North America to Asia, particularly North Asia, Korea, Japan, what have you, you're going over Alaska or you're skirting the southern coast of Alaska. So that was just as true then. And by the way, just as a side note, this route becomes a very important Lend-Lease route, sending planes and equipment across the Bering Sea to the Soviet Union. Over 8,000 aircraft are provided to the Red Air Force over the Bering Sea via the Alaska-Siberia, or ALSIB route, as it's called. So strategists know this. People can read a map and they see these advantages very, very quickly. And there's a feeling in Washington that we need to prepare Alaska. It's probably going to be a battlefront. And the person that George Marshall chooses, George Marshall being the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, is Buckner Jr., who's given a Brigadier General star and sent to Alaska and said, here's some plans, here's some resources we're sending along your way. Tell me what else you need, and let's see what we can do for you. And as Buckner's chief engineer would later say, he said Buckner was given a 10-year job and he managed to do it in a year and a half. In fact, most of the military installations that you see in Alaska even today were built under Buckner's aegis. Elmendorf Air Force Base, Fort Richardson, the installations around Fairbanks, all of that was built under Buckner's aegis in 1940 and 1941. The bases along the Aleutians, almost all of those were built on Buckner's aegis or in coordination with the Navy during this time period. I mean, they make small miracles happen. And they're able to get Alaska in some degree of readiness when the war comes in December of 1941.
Well, one of the things I really appreciate, especially as you were editing this book, is you included everything. Like you didn't leave anything out. And one of the items that I actually really enjoyed, especially at the beginning of the book, I mean, he talks a lot about his personal life, and there really isn't. It's kind of like a lead up to the actual Battle of Okinawa. But before the invasion, Buckner's diary, they're surprisingly domestic. So he talks about eggnog parties, his dog Betsy. What do these personal reflections tell us about his mindset and character months before commanding one of the largest operations in the Pacific?
So Buckner's diary in the book is divided into several sections. He didn't start writing one until January 1st of 1944.
Right.
So it covers the last few months of his time in Alaska and then the rest of his life in command of 10th Army. So basically when he gets to Hawaii and takes over 10th Army in July of 1944, from that 11 months later to his death.
Right.
Actually, the part in Hawaii is the part that really made me, the Okinawa stuff is absolutely fantastic. But the stuff in Hawaii and the vivid detail that he recorded was just as, to me, actually made it just as interesting. Because Buckner makes near daily entries for all of this. You're right. He notes, social engagements. He notes different things. He talks about his dog. Taken together, it is a glimpse of life both in wartime Hawaii, but as a chronicle of a senior officer. But Buckner had not served in the Central Pacific before. He'd known several of the officers like Chester Nimitz that he'd be working with and things like that. But when you really start to dive into that section, you see how he cultivates both personally and professionally these relationships and is very intentional, builds the relationships. He's also building a headquarters. 10th Army is created from scratch. And so you see, when he's visiting units and he talks about, going to softball games where, the ordnance department is playing the engineers, That's part of building a unit. And then he starts traveling around to the troops that are going to be under his command for the invasion. He's just as interested in the flora and fauna as he is the troops. And so, you take it all together and it's a really interesting insight. And then also the air trips. He documents his air trips. And that's an aspect of the Pacific War that most people don't realize, is just moving people around the Pacific via these air corridors. It's a window into the stupendous logistical achievement that was our war in the Pacific. And Buckner, to me, you put all that together, and that's even before we get to the invasion of Okinawa, but you put all that together and it's just a really interesting glimpse into how that war is working and how it's running in, the late part of 44 and into the first half of 1945.
I really liked his descriptions whenever he did visit a front where there was quite a bit of fighting. He always laid it out in very good detail. And I think that just simply goes to show his abilities to see things that most generals couldn't, at the
Well, you can
time.
tell he's very curious. He recognizes that he's in a different theater than Alaska. War, it's a different thing. And also when he visits, for example, he visits the Marianas in August of 1944. This is right after the campaign is over. We invaded the Marianas in June 15th, 1944. The campaign didn't end with the conquest of Guam until early August, like a week or two before he arrived. So the battlefields are as fresh can be. And so he is... he's seeing something immediately, and it's a populated island. These are populated islands that had been Japanese colonies for a while.
Right.
He's seeing this and he's realizing this is wherever I'm going to fight, whether it's Formosa, Taiwan, Okinawa, wherever, the places they're talking about sending me and my army are probably going to replicate in some way these battlefields. I need to pay attention.
You can definitely see that with Okinawa when he's talking about the civilian populace there and everything else, but I am gonna just skip ahead just a little bit here. So one of the things I actually wanted to start talking about was some of the inter-service friction that was taking place. The text actually it hints at some tensions regarding the performance of different units, whether that's the 27th and the Marine short parties. How did Buckner manage these internal criticisms, and what was his reasoning for prioritizing things like road repairs over airfield construction despite potential backlash?
So that's a great question. And the first point is that Buckner worked really, really hard to make sure that the Marines and the Army worked together. He actually split his headquarters in half. He had a Marine deputy and a Marine staff, and he had an Army side of his headquarters. And it should be pointed out, by the way, the 10th Army, for those who may not be familiar with the Okinawa campaign, 10th Army contained a U.S. Army Corps, 24th Army, and then it contained 2 Marine divisions in the 3rd Amphibious Corps under a guy named Roy Geiger. And Geiger and Buckner had met at the War College in the 1920s. They knew each other, and they had kept up a correspondence. They were personal friends. And that actually helped a lot. Relationships matter, as you know from your study of history. Relationships matter, particularly in senior commanders. But they also set the right tone. And who he picked for his Marine Chief of Staff was a guy named O.P. Smith, who will later command the 1st Marine Division at Chosin Reservoir in 1950. And very quickly established a respect with Smith. It's like, I understand, I'm not interested in this Army Marine stuff. We're here to win the war. I'm not here to beat the Marines. I'm here to beat the Japanese. And actually, he records in his diary how Nimitz, calls him in and says, we're going to Okinawa, and, kind of hints, are you okay with the Marines? There's been some issues before. And there's the great line in the diary, finding I deplore the whole thing. Nimitz said, you're in charge. You're going to command at Okinawa. So, very quickly, Buckner is very sensitive to this and wants, nothing. We're going to work together. And you see it through the campaign. The artillery supports each other. They give each other supplies. I mean, there's a lot of this. I mean, is it perfect? No. But is it as good as it can be? Well, as one of the Marine Corps historians of that campaign later said, if you want to study inter-service cooperation, study Okinawa. And that starts at the top. That starts with General Buckner. And it paid off. As terms of prioritizing road construction and over airfields, one of the big things is we should never forget that Okinawa was intended to be one of the jump-off points for the invasion of Japan. So it wasn't just airfields that they were trying to build. They were also trying to make this a logistics base. They were also needed to upgrade the roads. As a 10th Army's engineer said, Okinawa is gifted with a excellent network of bad roads. And they're on that island for 90 days in active combat. So just getting that army ashore and then, building the roads that you need to sustain, that's, let's build the infrastructure we need to prosecute the battle. And then when we're done prosecuting the battle, the engineers that have been paving the roads that can go pave runways. And to me, that's a completely sensible, sensible proposition, particularly when you think about the fact that you've got, over a dozen floating airfields offshore that are helping protect the invasion fleet and your beachhead. In other words, Task Force 58, the U.S. 5th Fleet, later U.S. 3rd Fleet. So to me, that makes sense. And it says something about his, he's focused on the objective and is willing to make the decisions and adjust as needed, always with an eye toward achieving the overall objective. He doesn't want to get distracted.
He seems very flexible with most of his decisions. And you brought up Nimitz, and this was not a question I had intended, but as far as his relationship with Nimitz was concerned, did he have a good working relationship with Nimitz? How close were they? How well did he work with the Navy overall in these operations, in its planning towards Okinawa?
So there were three primary naval personalities that Buckner needed to work with and for. Chester Nimitz as SINCPAC, as Commander-in-Chief for the Pacific. Raymond Spruance commanding 5th Fleet and the overall naval commander for the invasion. And then Richmond Kelly Turner, who was commanding the amphibious fleet that would actually physically take 10th Army ashore. The diary points this out that Buckner realized real fast that Nimitz was the key relationship, because Nimitz was going to be the person that would determine where Buckner would go and fight. And you see very quickly, Buckner is attending Nimitz's daily situation conferences. They have social engagements together. There's a lot of ways that you can tell that he's cultivating Admiral Nimitz, and they had interactions before, so they knew each other. But it's a way to kind of ingratiate himself and just make sure that Nimitz, they're building a good working relationship. He has a great relationship with Spruance. He has a great relationship with Turner. I think the diary bears that out, particularly when he and Turner on the way to Okinawa are having some very frank conversations about the Battle of Iwo Jima. Share a drink together. They're building a good rapport. And then, two of the other testaments that I would make of this is on the day that Buckner's killed, Nimitz is defending him to the press. There've been a lot of press attacks. Oh, Buckner's inflexible. He's moving too slowly. The battle should be over, all this stuff. And Nimitz is saying, hey, no, he's doing the best job. He's doing the best job he can. Samuel Eliot Morrison, who was a naval officer in that campaign, later said that faced with the defenses of Okinawa, nobody could have done any better than General Buckner in the 10th. And then Kelly Turner, there are some debates over, flanking maneuvers with amphibious assaults and things like that. And Kelly Turner made it clear, I'll do whatever you want. As long as I think that my forces can support you, I'll do whatever you want. Let's work out whatever you want to do. Let's make sure we negotiate it together, but I'll support you however we need to finish this battle. I put all that together, and that's evidence this guy knows how to work with the Navy. And it's another, we talked about Army and Marine inter-service cooperation, but I would argue this is just as great a case study.
Yeah, well, and I know I'm kind of going all over the place here, but Turner in March, he actually questioned Buckner on certain difficulties and uncertainties of their overall mission. So how was it that Buckner actually responded to Turner's skepticism?
So Kelly Turner, who has been involved in just about every major amphibious attack of the Central Pacific War from Guadalcanal in August of 1942 through Okinawa. So anything that Nimitz has done, all the Central Pacific campaigns, including the Marianas, as we talked about, that's been a Richmond Kelly Turner amphibious attack. He's just come back from Iwo Jima, and he and Buckner meet, and Kelly Turner talks about, this is going to be a real bad objective. We're going to have all these issues. I'm really concerned. And Buckner's like, I'm not concerned. I'm confident. We've got great troops. Everybody knows their job. It's going to be a tough campaign, but I'm confident we're going to make this happen. And Turner admits later, he's like, I was testing you. I wanted to make sure, because Buckner is not a well-known. He'd spent all those years in Alaska, so he's kind of new to the team. And so this is Turner's way of kind of assessing, okay, who is this Buckner guy that I'm working with? We've had some planning and we've had some discussions and stuff, but now that we're actually in the command ship on the way to the island, on the way to the objective, who is this guy? And what are we really, I'm trying to take the measure of him, and how are we going to be able to work together? And obviously Buckner told Turner what he wanted to hear, and the rest, as they say, is history. That's one of the foundation blocks of their great relationship that pays dividends during the battle.
Yeah, I think one of the overarching traits of any great officer is just kind of this kind of unique calmness about them. Like they know it's going to be okay. You see that in Buckner, you see that in a number of different officers, but I'd especially say Buckner, given how many times he goes to the front as well, which, obviously there's repercussions for that. But going back to the Battle of Okinawa, though, by late April, the Japanese were actually utilizing infiltration tactics and fortifications. How was it or how did Buckner actually describe the responsibility of these tactics, and why did he actually choose to avoid a hurry in his advance?
So, couple things here, and this is something that is not very well appreciated, is that U.S. intelligence believed that there were only 60,000 to 70,000 Japanese defenders on Okinawa in total. There were actually 120,000. So 10th Army is assessing the enemy casualties as they go. Actually, the tactical intelligence, except for this fact, actually ended up being pretty good. If you look at the G2 reports after the battle and the assessments that they're able to make of the Japanese defenses and the maps and in retrospect, it's actually really good. They do a really good job. But this estimate is believed until very late in the battle. By the end of April, they've estimated they've inflicted probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40,000 Japanese casualties. And they're up against kind of the southern third of the island, which is the Shuri line, as it's called, the Shuri, around the Shuri Heights and Shuri Castle. And it appears 10th Army's probably not that far from victory, based on what they know. The other thing that should be mentioned is that the divisions that have been fighting their way into the southern Okinawa and opposite Shuri have been fighting for a month solid, and they're pretty worn out. Like, to give you an example, one platoon in the 96th Division, 44 guys came ashore April 1st. By April 30th, only 11 had not been scratched in some way, either killed or wounded. And that's a representative platoon. Now multiply that by all the companies and all the regiments in the 3+ divisions that were committed into the fighting up to Shuri. And you get an idea, these guys are pretty worn out. So Buckner looks at the situation. There are proposals to land, the southern part, but he's really concerned, and he says this to his staff. He says, I don't want another Anzio. This would be, if you tried to speak specifically to a planned landing at Minatoga, this would be another Anzio, but worse. Which, if you know anything about Anzio, the lonely stand on the beachhead south of Rome, and 5th Army at Cassino was too weak to break through. And so, neither beachhead nor main front were strong enough to get to the other, and they were too far away to be mutually supporting. Buckner's not interested in that, especially with his divisions kind of worn out. They need relief. And so he says, we're going to swap them out with the Marines, which had just finished up the conquest of northern Okinawa. We're going to swap them out with the 77th Division, which has just conquered Iyashima offshore, and we're going to renew the offensive. And it appears that they're close to victory. Remember that casualty number. They estimate by April 30th, they've inflicted 15 Japanese casualties to every 1 U.S., and that ratio will hold during the battle, throughout the battle. So, again, based on what he knows, it makes sense. This is one of the reasons I wanted to do the diaries, because Buckner's voice has been missing from these discussions about the campaign for so long. But when you actually get into it from his perspective, using the only words from him that we have available, which are the letters in the diary, it illuminates a lot more, and illuminates a lot more of his thinking and his perspective that has been missing in many histories of the campaign.
Yeah,
I don't know if that comes anywhere close to answering your question, but that's...
No, it does. I mean, look, I think he recognizes combat efficiency. He understands how morale affects that, as well as just clear combat exhaustion. So despite whatever the press was saying or anything like that, at the end of the day, he's on the front lines. He knows what's happening. He understands what needs to be done in order to affect a better outcome. I think it's great that his voice is finally being put out to the public so that way we understand the context of that. So let's talk about what he's unfortunately, I think, most remembered for, which is his death. Um, so it was on the morning of June 18th. Buckner actually visited 8th Marines front line. What specific actions did he take that morning that illustrated his leadership style before, obviously, his death?
So Buckner liked to watch the forces in action, partly because he was interested in learning lessons and spreading things throughout the Army. Hey, these guys are doing this that works, that sort of thing. But also he could issue on-the-spot guidance and direction, and also keep his finger on the pulse of the battle. In particular, when a unit went into action on Okinawa for the first time, he liked to be there to instill confidence, to just let them know the commanding general's there. Command presence, I mean, there's a lot of different things going on. Create a little bit of psychological edge that you're considered important enough that the commander is here. 8th Marines is going into action that day on Okinawa for the first time. They had taken some offshore islands and had been committed and were attacking across a valley in the southwest, kind of the southwestern part of the island. And so Buckner goes there, and 2 of the battalions are actually in action. The 1st Battalion is in reserve, and there's regimental headquarters up on a hill, and the 1st Battalion's on the back slope. He gets there with his Jeep. He's got his 3-star license plate. He's wearing the helmet. Everybody knows, here's General Buckner. And he spends some time talking to the Marines, just kind of, hey, guys, how's it going? Talking, runs into a football player. Buckner played football at West Point. They talked for a little bit. 10, 15 minutes worth of just, talking to these Marines and kind of getting to know them a little bit and being a visible presence. No different than when Eisenhower went to visit the 101st Airborne on the eve of D-Day at that airfield. The famous photographs of him there talking to the soldiers. Absolutely no different. And then he goes up to the top of the hill to the regimental command post to watch the regiment in action. And he's there for about an hour or so with the regimental commander, and photograph is taken. There's actually some film footage that happens to be taken at the same time. And, he's up there watching the action, talking to the commander. You can see, particularly from the film footage, he's highly engaged with what's going on, very interested in how the 8th is doing. And, it's about noon, and he's been up there for about an hour, and he says, things are going so well, I think I'll move on to another unit. And just at that moment, he's standing by a big rock that you see in the last photograph of him. A Japanese shell strikes that rock and knocks everybody on the hill down. Most everybody's okay. Buckner has taken a piece of coral right to the chest, and he begins gasping for air. He's taken down the back slope to the regimental, where the regimental aid station is, where the 1st Battalion surgeon starts working on him. Buckner is gasping for air, tries to stand up, raises his hand, actually, somebody please help me stand. And a Marine private grabs it and says, "You're going home, General. You're homeward bound." And repeats that, "You're going home, General. You're homeward bound." And those are the last words that Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. hears as he gasps his last breath. And within 10 minutes of being hit with that coral, one of his aides then recites the 23rd Psalm, and they put his body in a Jeep, go back to 10th Army headquarters. And the next day, he is buried with full military honors. My uncle actually attended. He was a signal officer attached to headquarters 10th Army. In the presence of all available officers, he is buried in one of the 7th Division cemeteries on the island, which is extremely fitting because the 7th Infantry Division had fought on Attu in the Aleutians under Buckner's command in 1943. And then after the war, his family makes the choice to have him come home to Frankfurt, and he lays next to his parents. Not far from Daniel Boone's grave, as a matter of fact, the Frankfurt Cemetery.
That's it. Okay. I didn't know that. Well, Congress posthumously promoted Buckner to a 4-star general, but his gravestone only shows 3. Why?
I don't know. I will speculate by saying that it was because it was the rank he had when he died. And I respect that.
Yeah.
Were I the family, I'd probably leave it that way too. He died as a 3-star. It was a posthumous promotion, which is great, well-deserved, but he died as a lieutenant general.
Yeah.
It's the same reason, for example, husband Kimmel's grave at Arlington has 4 stars. Because he was a full admiral, but he retired as a 2-star admiral. But they put 4 stars on his grave because it's the highest rank he had. A little different circumstance, but nonetheless, I also agree with that too. But yeah, to me, it's actually appropriate that they never updated the grave and just left it as lieutenant general.
I think it is more fitting. I know that there's stories about other officers, the same situation where either it shows the rank that they attain later or before. And I think that's probably just how they would have wanted it, most likely. So,
It's one of those personal decisions.
yes,
And it's one of those, we look at these officers no matter what era, and sometimes we see them just as bloodless soldiers. We don't necessarily see the people inside the uniform, if you know what I'm trying.
yeah.
And this is one of those insights into the person, the family. Something like this is a deeply personal detail. What goes on a tombstone, particularly in this case, somebody killed in action as prominently as he was, is a deeply personal question and a deeply personal answer. And it provides some insight that should be noted for sure.
There was my uncle, he works for the VA, or he volunteers for the VA, and there was a woman that came in to get some information about, I believe it was her deceased father, and she was referring to him as a lieutenant, and when they looked up the information, sure enough, what was forgotten was that he actually was posthumously promoted to captain. And so that was kind of a really nice moment, and they were able to go back, they updated his grave and everything else, and it was kind of a reflection of what the family actually wanted to remember, and so I think that's really nice, and you're exactly right. I feel like especially within the military, it's almost a collective. It's one of the few institutions in our society that focuses so much on the collective and the mission and the objective. Lost within that is the individual itself. And so I do feel like, especially when it comes to their death, their grave, I feel like that's still one of the few choices that they and their family still have a voice in. So I think that's fitting.
Absolutely.
Uh,
Well, and when we think of Gold Star families, senior officers and their families are sometimes not. You tend to think of lower ranks when you think of Gold Star families.
Yeah.
And we sometimes forget that the Buckners were a Gold Star family. Adele Buckner was a widow of the war, no different than if her husband had been a lieutenant or a sergeant or what have you. George Patton's wife, Beatrice, same thing. George Marshall lost a stepson killed in action in Italy. So it's not just it's all ranks. You can find these types of personal anguish and deep personal loss of having sent people over and somebody's not coming back. They've paid the ultimate price. And it's a window into that side of it, if you will.
I'll say the most valuable aspect of this entire diary is the simple fact, number one, you give him a voice. And two is a question, which is, if you wanted a reader to take away anything from this diary, what specifically do you want them to take away from it?
I want them to hear his voice. I want them to, Buckner has been silent for so long that this is an opportunity to put his voice out there and for you to get a feel for who he was, what he stood for, and get a feel for this. He's one of only 3 generals to command a numbered field army in the Pacific in the entire war. The other 2 being Walter Kruger and Robert Eichelberger. And both of them have had memoirs and publications of their wartime writings and things like that. Buckner has not. And so I want people to walk away with an appreciation for who he was in his own words, but also what he did. I mean, he won the Battle of Okinawa. Wasn't over completely when he died, but he had won the battle. What he did in Alaska and the impact that he made there, still with us today. And trying to bring him out of the shadows and give people an appreciation. And that's what I want people to walk away with, is a greater appreciation for who he is, warts and all in some cases, but who he was.
No, well, I think that's awesome. And I just want to tell our listeners again, we're here with Chris Kolakowski. He's the editor of 10th Army Commander. You can pick up his book through Casemate Publishers as well as Amazon, correct? Okay, awesome. And I highly recommend you pick it up, mainly for your taste in military history. And remember, when you need a fix in history, check out History Fix. So sign up now for a free trial where you can view anything and everything history Chris, thank you again so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, happy Saturday, everyone, and enjoy your weekend.